On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Myles Guanzon. He is the VP of Engineering at Omada Health. Today's topic, we're going to talk about performance management, specifically what Myles is doing to handle this during this pandemic. Hopefully, this will be relevant to you post-pandemic if your teams stay remote. So I know it's a challenge for everyone, and I'm really excited to have Myles on to talk about this with us today. Thanks, Myles.
Thank you for having me. Very excited.
Absolutely. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. And just set the stage for everyone. We know you're the VP of Engineering at Omada. Maybe just do a brief intro and we'll jump into it.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, my role at Omada is VP of Engineering. Particularly, I'm responsible for the engineering teams that help deliver our program to our participants. So, it's a combination of web and mobile teams. And so, I get to work very directly with understanding how our member experience is going and being able to help people achieve their health outcomes from there.
Awesome. So I guess, we're going to talk about performance management. I think maybe the best place we can start is, pre-remote and actually, maybe help everyone understand at Omada, was your team completely in the office before the pandemic or were you guys always potentially remote?
Well, we were primarily in the office, but we did have remote folks. And that was including engineering as well. And in the office, the way that we operated was most teams defaulted to pair programming as a part of their day to day. And so that gives you a little bit of a picture of how we were working. For the remote folks, we tried to include them as well, but we had to leverage different tools in order to make that easy. And so some teams leaned into that. Some teams found other ways to work together that weren't specifically pair programming. But yeah, hopefully that gives you a picture of what we were looking like pre-pandemic.
And I guess when you were specifically talking about performance management, and I know you had some folks remote, we'll kind of leave those to one side for now and kind of maybe focus on, pre-pandemic, what performance management looked like for your team in particular or your teams. And then maybe we'll kind of build off of that to see how things have been changing for you guys.
So, in order to do performance management, I think first and foremost, it was really important for us to make sure that people understood what their expectations were in each of their roles. And so, what we did as an engineering management team is we got together and we spent countless iterations on our technical ladder so that we could cleanly map those roles and responsibilities. And it made it really good for not just performance management, but also growth opportunities so that people could actually look at, oh, well, here's what we're looking at the next level. And that way you could make it a lot more concrete. Of course, it's really the shape. So it's up to the manager to be able to curate those concrete actions on how to say what that means for you and your team. But that framework was the first thing that we did and made sure it was well understood by the people.
Awesome. So I guess it's safe to say the teams that were in person, in terms of the structure, obviously they're face to face. Can you talk a little bit about what the previous process looked like once you have to sit down? And I guess the other question really before we dive into is what was the frequency of your performance reviews?
At Omada, we have company-wide performance reviews, which happen every 6 months. So there's one in the middle of the year and another one at the end of the year. For engineering managers in the reports, they typically have a meeting like every 2 weeks. And so those are more of your informal check-ins as you see what's going on. But it's also a way for managers to check in with their reports and see how people are doing on the team, especially if people have been working together for on a project particularly closely. It gives you a really nice touch point to be able to ask some detailed questions about, for example, if with pair programming, are you driving? Are you navigating? Are you doing test-driven development? And being able to see if there's actual focus opportunities for people, especially if it's around object-oriented programming or server-client relation, those kinds of things. So that was the way that we'd be able to pick up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of more maybe the formalized process. And then I'm assuming informally there always, there probably are some ad hoc, I mean, maybe we don't have to call them performance reviews, but obviously there's people management that happen ad hoc that probably had some performance related discussions, whether there's issues or whatever it was that probably didn't wait for the 2 week check-in, I'm assuming.
Oh, that's true. I mean, there were a lot of ways to pick up on breadcrumbs because we followed a lot of the agile practices where we'd have stand-ups. What our teams also were doing were stand downs so that we can check in on the progress at the end of day and then tee up how it is we were going to operate the next day. And then we also had retrospectives, which we would do weekly. And so there, like, it was a nice opportunity for people to bring things up. And I really emphasize the culture of blameless, issues when things arise, because if someone was able to make a mistake, that's really more the system. It's not the person. That means the next person can make the same mistake if they don't have the right context. So we always focus on, well, what happened and what can we actually introduce as a part of either the system or process to make that less of a pain point moving forward.
Interesting. I like that. That gives people a pretty comfortable environment to kind of grow. And I guess, part of the goal of this podcast was talk about some of the challenges that you're facing with performance management, as people are now fully remote. And before we dive into that, I know you've set the stage, as to what the structure was, kind of how you guys operated. In terms of the remote people you had before everyone went remote, what was the process there? Because then what I'm going to hope to understand is how what that process was, and kind of understand how now the overall process incorporated maybe some of those, and how you guys have kind of built off of it. But what was the performance management process? Did it follow something very similar with the 6 month, obviously 2 week check in? Those were probably easy. The following the breadcrumbs, might have been a different challenge.
Definitely. What we like to work around is that following a cycle, what we're doing is we're talking about what people have accomplished and how they brought it. And we also focus on different focus opportunities. So if there is areas of improvement or areas that we want to strengthen, we clearly call those out in those cycles. And what's nice about that is because we have 6 months within there, those are the 6 months that we get to work with somebody on that. And so now that we've clearly stated, oh, here's the areas that we want to work on, this is where we can create concrete plans. And usually the one-on-ones is where we'll give those opportunities. We'll say, which one do you want to focus on first, or provide guidance on which of the areas that we want to do that. And then as they go, then we'll give feedback, either reinforce that and continue to build on that foundation, or make some changes based on what we are seeing.
Awesome. So I guess now, we set the stage of what was the norm before, and now I guess before we talk about what the current norm is of what you guys are doing, maybe go back a little bit and talk a little bit about what performance management looked like. I guess maybe some of the 2 week check-ins that got affected, because obviously everyone mid March, hey, we're all working from home and we're all adjusting to that. Was the performance management piece, did it take a little time to kind of, fall into that, or was the process pretty well defined where people just realize, hey, it's now just a Zoom meeting or a Google Hangout, and I'm just kind of adjusting my medium versus being in person?
No, great question. And I think, the way I'd start to answer that is, so like with performance management as an engineering manager, there's so many aspects that you have to take into account for your report. We talked about what the expectations are somebody's level, but there is real concrete things on how that applies to your team based on what they're responsible for. And so as a manager, what we would have is we'd have a bunch of different inputs into understanding how people were fulfilling those roles. There was a backlog, so obviously velocity is one thing that you can look at. You also look at quality of the work, if there's any issues or bugs that come at the end of that, which is another breadcrumb that you can use to see how things are going. And then the other part is sometimes, with your regular work, you don't always have an opportunity to see everything that's a part of somebody's expected role. So then as a manager, your additional responsibility is to make sure that you curate those opportunities so that you can have your report demonstrate those skills. And then you can use that as a part of your performance management and your performance review. And a really good litmus test for me was when I'd be looking at the ladder for a person and their role, I would try to understand how much of this have I seen myself? And any of the areas where I have gaps, this is where I'm looking to the rest of the team to say, hey, tell me about X and how did this go? And hopefully because of that 6 months time frame, by the time the formal cycle rolls around, I should have a really good idea about what's going on. And so this is like, my litmus test on how each month I would try to see how much am I seeing everything. That way I'm not going to be surprised or have a major gap by the time I hit the formal company cycle.
And I guess just in terms of, what you were observing pre-pandemic in terms of having, people sit across from you, I guess behaviors are slightly different versus, online meetings, in-person meetings. Was that a shift for you and the managers to kind of, read personalities and body languages and those subtle cues that maybe Yeah, obviously you still have the visual cues, but I think behavior changes on a WebEx versus or a Zoom versus what it is sitting across somebody in a conference room or at a desk.
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge shift and took a lot of work to figure out how we got past some of the problems that we had seen. And one of the most obvious examples is when you're in an office, it's easy to just see something in passing or somebody else to see something in passing. So you had a lot more opportunity to engage with folks either directly or indirectly. The challenges once we switched to remote was that every communication channel had to be deliberate. Like you didn't just have the chance of passing someone in the hallway or seeing somebody at their desk. Like you really had to schedule up a Zoom call in order to see something or to work with somebody. And I think that was a huge pain point for the teams that really relied on easily being able to contact one another very effortlessly. And so, like for us, what we had to do is we had to double down on creating those channels. We had to say, okay, well, we don't normally have these practices. And so our actual concept of stand downs did become a lot more of a pan engineering thing once we were in the lockdown because everybody's schedule was in chaos. Like sometimes someone would be there, sometimes someone had to get groceries. And so because we saw a lot of this, what we really anchored to was making sure that people and their teams really over communicated. Just continue over communicating, make sure nobody's left in the dark. And it became like a really core part of how we're working today. And I think that has been pretty successful in terms of being able to fill some of the gaps that we had while we were in the office.
Yeah, I guess, when it comes to you mentioned, when you're in the office, you can, determine, what pieces of information you have for somebody's technical ladder, and you'll go fill in the gaps. Obviously, maybe some of these are, just observe, like you mentioned, more opportunities just to see things. When it's now coming time to go back and look at that, and you're not at a loss, right? We don't have those extra cues. We don't have those, side conversations, those additional breadcrumbs. I know you're obviously more deliberate in setting up time with people. How are you? How is your team overcoming maybe some of those opportunities where you had those, those pieces of information? How are you filling in those gaps now?
Great question. I would say that so one example that we have is like I mentioned earlier that we're pretty heavy on pair programming, especially where we're in the office. And that was easy because we had the equipment and the setups to make that happen. Once we switched everybody to be remote and we had to rely on tools, it became very challenging. And I think we still wanted to emphasize the collaboration, but we didn't want to force it because it just wasn't an ideal situation. And we're trying to figure out the different tools to use. So, for example, one thing that we had done is we like some teams leverage the opportunity to what they could say is partner instead of actually pair, where they did have somebody they could talk with, collaborate with, work with something on, but not necessarily be on the same screen, writing the same code, all of that. Like it's probably not pair programming in a traditional sense, but people liked that there was somebody that they could directly go to in case something was going on. And so, in that sense, you still kind of had that extra opportunity of being able to get feedback while people are working with each other. But we also had to heavily start relying on metrics and inputs that we didn't look as closely at. We use GitLab as a part of our ecosystem. And now that we transitioned out of there from using GitLab and Jenkins. And one of the nice things that we got from it was that we got a lot of analytics around how people were, what contributions people were making, because we were a lot heavier in the PR mode, or GitLab says merge requests, so MRs. But we were a lot heavier in looking at those. People were having a lot more comments, engaging in there. And so we used it as one of like the many inputs that we would use in like looking at how somebody was performing. And it's good because you could see what that looks like across people of the same level. So you can see, oh, how's like somebody on this team contributing and how's somebody on this other team contributing who are on the same level. And so it's really up to the manager to take all these inputs and to make sense on that and say, is what I'm seeing correct? Or is there something that I need to dig into more? And then from there, it's creating those conversations. And because we already had the channels in the meetings, what it really meant was we doubled down on the ones that existed because creating more just isn't really the right answer. It's using the forums that we had previously and really pushing to use one-on-ones and getting feedback from folks. And also for managers in particular to be communicating what they see. Something that we didn't do as often while we were in the office, which was kind of surprising, is that if another manager had saw something from like a report from one of my teams, they just see it and just kind of pass it off. But I think, moving in this world, like we are like kind of soliciting feedback and saying like, oh, what's a great thing that you saw somebody do? And like, that type of input that we are seeing is like, oh, somebody came and just helped me with something. It was amazing. Just wanted to let you know. And like a lot more of these messages start coming through. And so I think it has to be a team effort also. Like a manager can't do it on their own. But I think we've used those types of things to help support each other in this time.
Interesting. No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You need more data points from different people because you don't have the eyes. And I think you guys have come up with a good structure around it. I guess now, when you're looking at, when you did have remote people previous to the pandemic, you obviously had them in the process. Now that you look at the process now and you're comparing everyone is remote, what have you seen as the shift? Because obviously more people are solving a wider problem to accommodate, an entire company being, remote versus like, a handful of pockets of people here and there.
I would say that one of the challenges pre-pandemic was that not every conference room that we had was set up for remote people. It wasn't until the beginning of 2020 where each room had like its camera, like even some of like the larger working spaces that we had that had whiteboards and like those board like and everything like up there. So I think, one of the things was that I could admit that like we probably weren't the most remote friendly at the time because we relied so heavily on in-person collaboration. But as, people were remote, we found that, well, it's not that we couldn't translate a lot of these rituals and processes remotely. It's just we never really had the right push to do that. Because I think for some of the remote teams, most of them were remote already. And so they were operating in this fashion versus actually having like this mixed bag of some people are remote and some people aren't.
What's interesting is, I mean, I run a recruiting company, and the one thing I could tell you that people used to ask me, and it wasn't until the pandemic that I fully understood why they would ask, is they would always ask, is the company remote friendly? Am I going to be the only one remote? Do they have processes around, how to deal with people remote? And it's interesting because now that you start looking at those questions, maybe a year, 2, 3 years ago, and you look at, the difference in obviously how we have now addressed remote working, it's a big gap, and I think a lot of people previously were hesitant if somebody or organization was not remote first so that they, had other people remote. They had an idea of how to worry about the engagement. And I think performance management was probably a massive component to that because somebody's thinking, well, how are they going to figure out how I'm working or if I'm producing quality work? And everything you mentioned now has kind of addressed a lot of those maybe concerns people had pre-pandemic.
Oh, no, definitely. And I think the places you would really see that were when like something as simple as stand up became painful for the remote people, especially because like there were times where somebody had to work from home and that was fine, at our company. But like what we'd end up doing was like passing around the laptop but sometimes if you just put it down and people are kind of in a group and talking, like it's not always easy to hear. And, it's not until you're on the other end of that that you really feel that type of pain. And, I guess one thing is now I think we're all a lot more empathetic to that situation for sure.
Yeah, it's funny is, pair programming is, we could talk about that and the effects of being remote, but it's even something as simple as that, which was a part of your guys' process, had to be thought through. I was joking with the engineering manager one day, I think it was a month or so ago, and I said, too bad there's not a TikTok for the split duet screen effects that they have where one person's on one side watching the other person work or I'm just kidding. But I'm sure somebody's out there working on a way to make pair programming as realistic as possible. As a lot of people use it. And I mean, you guys have come around, you have a workaround, but obviously I'm sure you'd love to kind of go back to more of the core processes you guys did have.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for a lot of the teams too, we are pretty receptive to trying out new things and seeing how we go from there. Our culture is pretty deliberate on making sure that when we are changing something that we're not losing the benefit of the process or system that we had before and making sure that like okay, we're always going to be moving into a better state in the next time. So maybe if somebody finds something for us, I'll be we'll definitely give it a try.
There you go. Miles, I wanted to say thanks for being on the podcast, talking about, some of the challenges you've been working through. I think it's been really awesome.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. If somebody wants to reach out to you, we'll link your LinkedIn, I guess, URL. If somebody wants to reach out, follow up on any of these topics, that's okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So that's the end of this episode. Appreciate Miles for coming on, sharing his thoughts, and we'll be back again with a different guest, different set of topics. As always, I ask for two things. One is I really like getting the topics that you guys have been messaging me about on LinkedIn. I think the list is kind of growing. I need to kind of update it so that I have more managers talking about different things. I think in the case of Miles, he had a great idea to talk about performance management during this pandemic and the shifts that he's been seeing. The other is keep subscribing. The podcast has just, organically been growing like crazy. And I say it every episode that I really never thought we'd get as many listeners and subscribers as we do. But tell a friend. Apparently, we're doing some good work and we're bringing value, and that's what we love to do. So thanks for listening. And until tomorrow. Thanks.